From CBS News Miami, this is Facing South Florida with Jim DeFede.
Welcome to Facing South Florida. I'm Jim DeFede. Let me start by wishing everyone a happy Easter. Now, I'm not a particularly religious person, but I will tell you that Easter is one of my favorite holidays because at its core it represents eternal hope, the belief that from darkness there can be light. I like that sentiment a lot. Unfortunately, living in Florida, we have a lot of sunshine, but not enough light. And that brings me to today's show. As we speak, nearly 1 million Floridians, many of them children, have lost their health insurance because the state has created a Medicaid system so dense and complex that more than 960,000 people have lost their health care coverage, not because they are no longer eligible, but because of what is termed as procedural reasons. Let me explain. During the pandemic, nearly 5 million Floridians received expanded Medicaid benefits. When the pandemic was declared over a year ago in March of 2023, the state began a process known as the unwinding. During the unwinding, everyone who had been receiving extended benefits needed to reapply to prove they were eligible. That's fine. But the system created by the state is so bad, nearly 1 in 4 either haven't received the forms or can't understand them. Florida Health Justice is now suing the state of Florida, and I spoke to Lynn Hearn, the lead attorney for the group.
Our concerns are that the unwinding has really shined a spotlight on problems with the Medicaid redetermination process that have long been there, but maybe didn't get the attention that they deserved. But now we are seeing in such record numbers that the process of redetermination itself is broken and is not really designed in a way to enable the majority of eligible people to stay on. There are so many obstacles on the way. So that's our concern.
So obviously, right now, I think the total number of people who have been processed to date is about 4.3 million. We were talking earlier, out of the 4.9, there's still a little bit of a lag. They're still catching up with it. But of the 4.3 million, from the numbers that you've seen, my understanding, you told me earlier, only 9% were automatically renewed. That seems like a very small number. Is it a small number in your opinion that just 9% were automatically renewed?
It's not just a small number, in my opinion. I mean, there's groups that track this data nationwide, and Florida is routinely in the bottom quartile of states in terms of being able to conduct electronic renewals. So that's one problem. I mean, we like to think of ourselves as a pretty technologically advanced state with a lot of access to databases and automated processes, but that number speaks volumes as far as what we're not able to do.
Well, I got to disagree with you a little bit, Lynn. I'm not sure that Florida is known as a state that does processes really well. A lot of this reminds me of the issues that the state had, at the beginning of the pandemic, just on unemployment rates and unemployment reimbursement and qualifying for unemployment. We remember the long lag times and the nightmarish process. But I'm not trying to drag you into that, but I'm just saying that the state doesn't necessarily have a great track record. And in looking at some of the other numbers, 21% were renewed through this process where they received the paperwork, they were able to fill it out, submit it, and were able to get it. But on the flip side, 22%, so actually more people were disenrolled because of procedural issues. What could some of those procedural issues have been? What does it mean to be disenrolled because of procedural issues?
It's really anything that is not a substantive eligibility determination. So it could be that a person didn't receive the notice. It could be that they weren't able to get onto an online account in order to submit paperwork. It could be that the state was unable to verify some of the paperwork that they submitted. It could be that a notice went to 2 addresses ago, and these are all things that we've actually seen in our practice that have happened. that have caused people to be procedurally terminated. And just another way to look at that data in terms of the number of procedural terminations. I looked at this before we started talking. Of the number of people that are being terminated from Medicaid, 70% of them are being terminated for procedural reasons rather than for substantive eligibility reasons. So before we were talking about the number of overall process, but of termination, 70% are procedural. So that's concerning.
What we're talking about, just to put numbers to it, is nearly 1 million people have lost health insurance in Florida because of some procedural issue. Not because they were found to be ineligible, not because they no longer qualified, but because of a procedural issue. And as you said, it could have been anything from the state didn't have their current address to, there was a problem in how they filled out the forms.
There's just a series of obstacles that people encounter, starting with the notice itself, telling people what determination has been made. It's very difficult to decipher. So the next thing they do is pick up the phone and call the call center, and the call center has around a 41% rate of calls not being able to get through in the first instance because they don't have enough people answering the phones to be able to put someone on hold. And then once a person is on hold, they have an abandon rate of 42% and an average hold time in the area of 40 minutes. So not everybody has that kind of time to be able to stay on the phone. If they are actually able to get on the phone and get a person, the likelihood of getting a person who can actually answer their question correctly and completely and getting a resolution for their case it's very, very low. The state has contracted with a third party to be the initial answerer of all calls related to Medicaid, and they are intentionally a lower level of provider, and they are only able to handle the most basic of inquiries. So even when you get to a person, chances are they are not going to be able to handle your situation. So then you're talking about either another call or a transfer or a call back.
There's something deeply wrong with this. I mean, again, if 40% of the people who try to call can't even get the call answered, and then once they get answered, if more than 40% then are on hold so long that they then drop off the call, and then those who actually make it to a person end up not talking to a person who can actually help them because they don't have the information. I don't know how far you're willing to go with this, but that sounds to me like almost like the state is deliberately trying to keep people from being able to access this program and be able to be on the healthcare rolls. Again, I don't want to draw you into that, but it doesn't sound like a very efficient system to me.
Well, I have no problem agreeing with that. The call center, I think, is kind of the last indicator of a process that is broken at all of the steps that precede it. Another statistic to look at is the actual number of calls made to the call center, and we have nationwide data, and Florida is usually number one or number two for the number of calls. So what that tells you is that there's something in Florida's process that is prompting a high number of calls to begin with, because this shouldn't have to be resolved with an army of call agents. That's not the solution here, to hire more call agents. The solution is to earlier in the process have more automated terminations and have clearer notices and have better communications with clients about what's expected, so there's no need for a phone call on the back end.
And I think it's also important to point out, and I want to make this clear as well, when we talk about nearly 1 million people being denied health care because disenrolled for procedural issues, a lot of those are children, correct?
I don't have that number handy, Jim, but certainly historically we've seen that number be about half of the terminations that are happening. So,
but you would agree that a large number of these people who are affected, this million people that we're nearly a million people we're talking about, who are lost in this bureaucratic maze, are in fact children, correct?
Oh, absolutely. And we also look at the back end, the enrollment numbers for children, and we have seen about 500,000 or more children. That number of reduction of enrollees in Medicaid. So that all lines up. And that's just really concerning because the income limits for children to be eligible for Medicaid are much higher for adults. So just because an adult has lost Medicaid eligibility does not at all mean that the child also is ineligible. And families may not understand that. And so they may just assume that if they're not eligible, then their child isn't, and not take any further steps to inquire.
Am I right in believing that for a lot of these people, a number of the million or so people who are affected by this disenrollment because of bureaucracy, they won't even realize they no longer have health insurance until they show up at a doctor's office and are then told, oh, by the way, you no longer have Medicaid, you no longer have health insurance. Is that correct?
That's right. And we hear from those people. Actually, we hear doctors' offices calling and canceling appointments prior to the appointments because they have checked to make sure there's coverage and there isn't. Or worse yet, we are hearing right now from a number of parents of critically ill children who receive in-home nursing and other services, and their providers are contacting them and letting them know that they're going to have to stop coming in a matter of days because the provider has determined that the child is no longer going to be eligible for coverage. So that's putting these families in a really tough situation.
As I mentioned earlier, Florida Health Justice is suing the state in federal court. A trial is scheduled to take place in May in Jacksonville. We'll stay on top of it. But when we come back, Florida remains one of only 10 states to turn down billions of dollars from the federal government to expand Medicaid. So if the legislature won't do it, perhaps voters will. Stay with us.